I can go first if you guys want.
Yeah, let's do it.
All right,
Let's
cool.
do it.
So, all three of these albums hit three different genres, right? And we were 15, 16 when they came out.
14.
You were you were 14 for some of them. Yeah,
Yeah,
if it was
20, I'm
late,
gonna-
if there was late in the year, you were 15. Though.
Right. It's true.
Yeah. So, and we all know what Nate's birthday is now. So,
Yeah, exactly.
but yeah, the album that I chose, and we have a whole list of 45 of them, but this one was. It was a big follow-up to an album that was very, very large for this band. It was Kid A by Radiohead. So Radiohead is coming off the Bends and then OK Computer, right? And those two albums were, especially OK Computer, were massive for them. And
So big, yeah.
and I remember, Nate, before you moved to California, I remember watching what was the name of that DVD they did? Meeting People is Hard or something like that.
Oh shoot. Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
And the Radiohead DVD that came out in between OK Computer and Kid A, and
Yep.
it was like them kind of on the press tour for OK Computer and live for that, and how they were just kind of gassed by the whole thing. Like they were done with being Radiohead and done with all the press and the people and the the stuff that went along with big band, and they were big at this point. So they went back into the studio. They got together and kind of went in a completely different direction. There's some elements of this on OK Computer, but they went full on like electronic and kind of unplugged a little bit from the guitars, changed their sound completely. And at the time, obviously not super well received, but they, it became a classic as far as like electronic kind of pop, kind of rock records went. And the funny thing is they used the same producer, Nigel Goodrich. He was the same producer as the OK Computer album, and that album is a little more rock oriented. It's got Karma Police, it's got Airbag, which is probably my favorite Radiohead song. And then they went in a completely different direction and kind of went more synthy and computery and keyboardy. And it didn't work out early, but it ended up being essentially a scene classic as far as that type of music went. Probably one of the first, if not the first album to fully utilize the internet as a means to promote it. They obviously were putting songs out as singles, but they didn't make any music videos for it. They did a lot of stuff through the internet. It was available promotionally as a stream early on, and in 2000, think about 2000, not a lot of people had the wherewithal to stream an album. It was probably a lot of dial-up still. I think we were still on, or just barely into cable internet at that point at my house. So they're using the internet to stream an album and get it out there. That's ahead of its time, right? I mean, and they're the band that ended up being one of the first bands to put an album out and do the pay what you want thing with In Rainbows after this. So they've always been kind of on the forefront as far as this goes. They did a lot of bootleg performances and videos from fans put on the internet. That was kind of something that had not been done before as far as promotional goes. It was their first #1 album in the U.S., which is kind of crazy if you think about it. Like the Benz was really big. You'd think OK Computer might have made it there, but it didn't.
Pablo
Kid
Honey,
A-
maybe. That was the first. Yeah, so maybe not with that one, but
OK Computer would have been probably the one you would think, but
Yep.
because of OK Computer, this album went #1 to probably some upset people. But it ended up being, I mean, if you go back to it now, it's a great record front to back. It's just different. They like to do. I think I'm gonna go Key Tracks for me right now. Key Tracks, Everything in Its Right Place, which is the album opener, doesn't sound like a Radiohead song at that point. It does now. It sounds absolutely like a Radiohead song now. But if you go back to that time, it sounds very synthy and poppy, and they're messing with Tom York's vocals, and there's not a lot of, you don't hear a lot of band, you don't hear a lot of guitar, you don't hear a lot of the drums. It's just very keyboard and Tom York, and that's what you're gonna get. But that song's really cool. The National Anthem is a fun song. There's a lot of horns towards the end that are kind of funky and weird.
I revisited it
different for them.
recently, a couple nights ago, and I was like, I don't remember this track, and I was really vibing with it
The
though.
second half of it, right? The second
Yeah.
half of it's all horns, and they're just here's this horn, and then here's this horn, and then it's just fun.
Just big
right?
band. It feels very
Yeah.
big band.
And it's completely different than everything in its right place, which is kind of crazy to me. Optimistic is probably my favorite track on the record.
Oh yeah.
That's a kind of straightforward rock song, and that's probably why it's my favorite track on the record. But that song could have fit in with OK Computer. How to Disappear Completely, I think, is an underrated Radiohead song. I listened to it again today for the second or third time this week just to in prep for this, and it just it's a vibe. Like there is a feeling of sadness. There's a feeling of we don't want to be around all these people anymore. We want to just kind of withdraw into ourselves, which they obviously did. So some would say to a fault if you go all the way to the King of Limbs situation where it's just all electronic and they're not even a band really anymore. They've come out of that sense, but that song is kind of the starts of that. And then Idiotech is another big one that was a single and very poppy, very synthy situation that is, it's almost like some of the bands that you would hear in the late 80s that were like new wavy, like they kind of brought new wave back 20 years after. So this album was crazy to me. It's a complete shift from what they were as a band. There were a couple pieces of OK Computer that sounded sort of like this, but they were more of a rock band back then, right? So 3 years later, they're putting this album out. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I mean, my two standout tracks are Optimistic and Idiotech. For me, I mean, I'm not the biggest Radiohead fan, and that's not a negative. It's actually, I do like them, and I get the hype, but I don't always go back and listen to them. However, again, another backpedal here. I listened to this album in the last week, and I get the hype. Like if you go on, if you search, a lot of the, RollingStone.com or any of those sites, and type in like Radiohead albums ranked, Kid A is one on all of them, on pretty much all of them. So I do get it. For me, I'm an In Rainbows guy because that's the album I listened to the most in the moment. I was a little late to the game, but I remember hearing Optimistic and Idiotech in the moment in 2000.
Yeah, I love this album, and it's a pretty complex band. So it's not easy to get into them, even though there's some cool like melodic singing elements. But I can imagine Twan, depending on how you get into them, it's not an easy one. It's such a weird, diverse band. If it wasn't for my brother, I probably wouldn't have had the introduction to this band like I had, and I think it would have probably taken it all the way to In Rainbows to understand what was going on here. But In Rainbows is also such a fantastic album to get into the band because it's so front to back. But yeah, I'd already been into them. So when Kid A came, I was kind of like, I was ready. I was like, I went to the record store day of, and it was kind of thing ready to grab it on the day that it was released. But everything in its right place, like that song as an opener for an album, like, wow, like way to set the tone. Like it's a killer jam.
Well, and it starts off kind of just Tom York singing in his falsetto, everything, and it just like gets into, and then more stuff gets added as the song goes on, which is really cool. And I mean, not that if you have a little straight drink and listen to it, you might be all right. Like it's a cool vibe as far as how that song goes from start to, and then it like kind of closes out with just the keyboard synth stuff at the end. That's just kind of this is how this is gonna fade out. It's a great opening track. But if you're a fan of the Bends, it might be a little different for you to try to get into this. So Pablo Honey, the Bends, pretty straightforward rock records, and then OK Computer is mostly a rock record with a little bit of a departure here and there, but this is a complete departure as far as that stuff goes.
So does this album pass the 20-year test?
Yes, for me, yes.
I think it does.
I would say 100%. Yeah. If anything, when Tone is talking, my mind's always just like spinning in all these different directions. And when Tone is talking, I was like, 1999 into 2000, it felt like we were kind of going into the future, kind of like 2019 going into 2020. And now like really is, because we're going to hazmat suits for shows and stuff like that. But like, but this Radiohead album kind of has that futuristic element to it. With the synths, and it's just like you were saying, it's such a departure from prior that it was like, oh wow, they're kind of changing direction, and it makes sense because we're going into 2000, so everything felt like, oh, we're going to go into this amazing paradigm shift in terms of how songs sound, and this was kind of a precursor to that to an extent. It was just an experiment kind of, but shows their intense diversity as a band.
Yeah, and the kind of crazy thing is they recorded this alongside Amnesiac, which is the album that came out after it the following year. Which, if you think about it, like this album at the time was not super loved. I mean, it ended up gaining that cult following as far as, and not even cult, like they're still a huge band, but as far as this album was concerned, at the time it was kind of not panned, but it had trouble. And Amnesiac was kind of more of the same, right? Because it was recorded around the same time. So if you listen to Amnesiac, it's probably even a little more experimental, a little more kind of out of left field. The crazy thing to me, I was looking at the kind of the Napster-ish numbers and the streaming numbers. This streamed 400,000 times, and today that's a pretty good number, right? In 2000, that's freaking crazy. Like how is that even possible with the way internet was back then? People don't remember, but 2000, the internet is a very different world than it is today. Like it's all in our pockets now. It wasn't in our pockets until 10 years ago, maybe. You know, really for the better, 6 years ago was really in our pockets. Well. The fact that this was streamed that many times in the year 2000 is people on their computer at home downloading the album to listen to it or streaming the album to listen to it. That's nuts. That's a lot of people.
It is a lot. And I think you're right. Like that was the cusp between dial-up and cable. And if it was the cable, if it was the dial-up era, you had to really if 400,000 people, that shows you how in demand they were, because a lot of times you would download it overnight and it would cut out. You'd wake up and it didn't download, you know?
Yeah.
So that I'm with you. That's very surprising.
Well, you know what I just thought of is, I'm just trying to think, those numbers are alluding toward a demographic that's tech savvy, I think, because Radiohead has like an interesting, well, I think they have a fan base that spawns all walks of life, but I just remember the Kid A era was very much like, and I'm calling myself a geek, like kind of like geeky, like tech savvy, like into, you know, I'm going to go the route, I'm going to actually wait and make this album download kind of thing. Whereas if it was some kind of like garage band, you know, that just wouldn't be the case. So it kind of goes in tandem to an extent. And especially with the theme of this album. So
obviously promoters didn't like it. I know that the song Optimistic, there's the line, and this is, where was it? I just had it. The best you can is good enough. That came from Tom's girlfriend at the time, because he was kind of down. He was down on the process of recording the album and was like, I don't know if this is going to be any good. Like, we're just kind of done. So this is a very pivotal moment for them. Like they were kind of on the verge of not being a band anymore, like just being sick of not each other necessarily, but just the life. And he's like writing Optimistic, which is not optimistic, but she's like, the best you can is good enough. And he's like, oh, I'm going to put that in the song. And I mean, I love that song. That's a great song.
It is a timeless album. Like if that dropped in 2020, people would still be into it. You know what I mean? Because a lot of bands are Radiohead clones. Like they've mirrored themselves after that sound. And that's a testament to the album. I mean, I get it. I'm kind of a Radiohead convert. Like I in 2020 I get the hype. In 2000, probably a casual fan. I was probably a casual fan back then.
I think I was crossing over from casual to like, oh, I completely get what's going on here. Even though I was a fan before, but it was like such a change in sound that it was like it's hard to like grasp. You're like, but I kind of like OK Computer.
Yeah, right. And they played, just getting back to what they did around this time, they did some like big kind of tent shows in Europe where they just put a big tent up and people would show up in a field somewhere, which is kind of crazy. It's, I mean, that's awesome. That's kind of a precursor to some of the festivals we saw in the mid 2000s, right? Like just here's a big tent, show up, and here's Radiohead. Like, okay, yeah, I'll go to that. And same thing with they came to the U.S. They played smaller venues by themselves, and then did some of the bigger venues on the second leg with Sigur Rós, but mostly by themselves. And they recorded, I might be wrong, the live recordings, which is a good, go back and peep that if you've never listened to that. That's a fun live kind of record. Has the national anthem on it. It has Optimistic, some other stuff. So that's cool.